At exactly 3 minutes into the test, the gravity system stopped making sense. I have been running advanced combat conditioning at the Orion Military Academy for 19 years, and in those 19 years I have learned one unbreakable truth. Gravity does not lie. It strips away pride. It exposes weakness. It reduces even the most decorated cadet to trembling limbs and shallow breaths. It is the one universal equalizer across species, across worlds, across every evolutionary advantage the galaxy has to offer. And yet on that morning, standing inside Chamber B, watching a human cadet named Ethan Cole, I realized there was something far more dangerous than gravity, something that made our entire understanding of strength look incomplete. The chamber was calibrated to 1.5 standard gravity when the session began, a level most cadets could tolerate for about 30 seconds before posture degraded, breathing shortened, and balance failed. I watched 22 cadets from 12 different species step forward one by one, each confident at first, each certain their biology would give them an edge, and each one proved wrong within moments. Knees bent, shoulders collapsed, movements slowed as if the air itself had thickened. Around them, exactly as expected, exactly as it had always been, routine, predictable, almost boring. That was before the human entered the room. Ethan Cole arrived without announcement, without ceremony, just another transfer cadet assigned to my class. Average height by Terran standards, maybe 5'10", lean build, nothing visually impressive, no armor enhancements, no visible augmentations. Just a standard issue training uniform that somehow looked too simple for a place like this, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady, but not confrontational. The kind of presence you might overlook if you were not paying attention, and I will admit, at first I was not paying attention. The others noticed him, of course they did. They always notice humans, not out of respect, but out of curiosity, sometimes amusement, sometimes quiet dismissal. I heard the whispers, the subtle shifts in tone, the assumptions forming in real time. Death Worlder. One cadet muttered, but not with fear, more like skepticism, as if the word itself had lost meaning through repetition, as if Earth's reputation had become exaggerated myth instead of measurable fact. I initiated the next phase of the session, increasing the chamber to 2.0 gravity, a level that pushed most species to their functional limit. Alarms flickered softly across the control panel as the system compensated, and one by one the cadets reacted exactly as predicted, feet adjusting, shoulders tightening, some stepping back instinctively, others trying to maintain composure but failing in subtle ways. Micro-instability, inefficient movement, all the small signs that gravity was winning. Ethan Cole did not step back. He did not tense. He did not adjust his stance in any noticeable way. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, as if waiting for instructions that had not yet been given. I watched more closely then, narrowing my focus, searching for indicators, increased respiration, muscle strain, even a slight shift in balance. Anything that would confirm he was experiencing the same force as everyone else in the room. But there was nothing, no visible response, no measurable hesitation, just stillness, controlled, quiet, almost indifferent. Around him, the room told a different story. Heavier air, slower reactions, cadets struggling to maintain composure under the pressure. And in the center of it all, the human remained unchanged, not defiant, not dramatic, just unaffected. One of the cadets let out a strained breath. Another adjusted footing and nearly lost balance. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore, and for the first time that morning, the routine felt disrupted, not broken, not yet, but altered in a way I could not immediately explain. I glanced at the system readout, verifying the numbers: 2.0 gravity, stable output, no anomalies detected, everything functioning exactly as designed, which meant the anomaly was not the system. It was him. Ethan shifted slightly then, just a small roll of his shoulders, like someone loosening up before a light jog. And for reasons I could not yet define, that simple motion carried more weight than anything I had seen in this chamber before. I stepped forward, voice steady, maintaining authority, because that is what instructors do when something unfamiliar enters the equation. We control the environment. We define the rules, we test the limits, and in that moment, I made a decision that would change the direction of the entire session. If gravity reveals truth, then I would simply increase the pressure until the truth revealed itself. I reached for the control panel, eyes still on the human, and began the next escalation. I increased the gravity to 2.5 standard, and the chamber responded instantly, a low hum rising beneath our feet as the system redistributed force across every surface. The air itself seemed to thicken, not physically but perceptually, as if movement required intent instead of instinct. I watched the cadets react in sequence. Not all at once, never all at once. First the subtle signs, a shift in posture, a delayed step, then the more obvious, knees bending under load, shoulders tightening, breathing becoming deliberate instead of automatic. One cadet reached out for the wall, not out of panic but necessity. Another lowered to one knee in what they would later describe as a controlled descent. But we both knew what it was: gravity doing exactly what it was designed to do, exposing limits, defining boundaries, rewriting confidence into caution. I kept my attention centered on Ethan Cole. He did not reach for the wall. He did not lower himself. He did not even adjust his stance beyond that earlier roll of his shoulders. And that detail stayed with me longer than it should have, because at 2.5 standard gravity, there are no wasted movements. Every adjustment has purpose. Every motion is a negotiation with force, and yet has looked casual, almost absent-minded, like someone loosening up after sitting too long, not like someone compensating for increased load. The room grew quieter, not because the cadets stopped reacting, but because their reactions became internal, focused, controlled, the kind of silence that comes when effort replaces conversation. I could hear breathing now, not loud, but present, measured. Inhales, careful exhales, the sound of bodies adapting under pressure. And still, in the center of it, the human stood as if the chamber had not changed at all. One of the larger cadets, a species evolved in higher gravity environments, attempted to take a step forward, a simple demonstration of control, but the movement stalled halfway, balance compromised, momentum miscalculated, and he corrected quickly, but the correction itself told the story. Even the strongest were negotiating now. Ethan took a step then, not forced, not calculated, just a step heel to toe, smooth, efficient, unhurried, like crossing a quiet room on a normal day. And that was when the shift happened. Not in the system, not in the gravity, but in perception, because it is one thing to stand still under pressure. It is another thing entirely to move through it without resistance. I checked the panel again, confirming output, 2.5 stable, no fluctuations, no errors. The system was functioning perfectly, which meant the inconsistency remained where it had been from the start. I felt the first hint of something unfamiliar then, not doubt, not yet, but curiosity sharpened into focus, the kind that demands resolution, because unresolved variables do not belong in controlled environments. I increased the gravity again. 3.0 standard. The warning indicators activated this time, not alarms, but advisories, soft pulses of light along the console edges, reminding me that we were entering ranges not intended for prolonged exposure, and the effect was immediate. Several cadets dropped their gaze, not in defeat, but in concentration, posture lowering, movement minimizing, conserving energy, adapting strategies, exactly as trained, exactly as expected. Ethan Cole tilted his head slightly, just enough to register awareness, not strain, not discomfort, awareness, like someone noticing a change in temperature rather than a shift in force that should have made movement significantly more difficult. And then he did something that reframed the entire exercise. He looked around the room, not at the system, not at me, at the other cadets, observing, measuring, as if trying to understand their reactions rather than his own. I took a step closer, closing the distance, because proximity reveals details distance hides, and I needed details now. I needed confirmation of something concrete, something measurable, something that fit within the framework I understood. His breathing remained steady. His posture remained aligned. There was no tremor in his stance, no micro-instability in his balance, nothing that suggested he was compensating for increased gravitational load. And yet the load was there, verified, confirmed, undeniable. I spoke then, not loudly, not aggressively, just enough to cut through the controlled silence of the chamber, maintaining authority while acknowledging the anomaly without naming it. "Cadet Cole," I said, status. He turned his head toward me, expression neutral, not dismissive, not impressed, simply attentive, and for a brief moment I expected some indication, some acknowledgement of the pressure, even the smallest comment about adjustment or calibration, something that would anchor his experience to the environment we were all sharing. Instead, he considered the room again, then looked back at me and said, calm and even, "Is this the standard setting for this exercise?" Not a complaint, not a challenge, a question. And in that question, delivered without strain, without urgency, without any sign that the current conditions were unusual, I realized we were no longer testing gravity. We were testing an assumption. I did not answer his question immediately because there are moments in training where silence reveals more than instruction ever could, and this was one of those moments, the chamber holding at 3.0 standard gravity, the system stable, the cadets adjusting as best they could, and in the center of it all, Ethan Cole stood waiting, not impatient, not confused, simply present, as if the answer mattered less than the observation itself. And that detail unsettled me more than any visible reaction would have, because cadets under pressure usually seek confirmation. They look for guidance, they search for boundaries, but he did not. He observed first, questioned second, and that order was not typical for someone in their first advanced conditioning session. I stepped closer to the control panel, but kept my eyes on him, maintaining the balance between authority and analysis, because whatever this was, it was not random. There are no random outcomes in controlled environments, only variables we have not yet identified, and I intended to identify this one. 3.0 is above standard for initial assessment, I said, voice even, measured, giving him context without giving him an answer, because I needed to see how he would process incomplete information. That is where patterns reveal themselves, not in certainty, but in ambiguity. He nodded once, a small, efficient motion, no visible strain in the neck, no delayed response in the muscles, just acknowledgement. And then he did something I have never seen any cadet do at that level of gravitational load. He shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other, not to compensate, not to stabilize, but as if testing comfort, like someone deciding which stance felt more natural during a casual conversation. And the simplicity of that movement carried a kind of quiet contradiction that did not belong in this room. Around him, the others were holding position, conserving energy, minimizing movement, because movement cost too much under this level of force. And yet he moved without hesitation, without calculation, as if the cost did not apply to him the same way it applied to everyone else. One of the cadets attempted to straighten their posture and immediately corrected back into a lower stance. The effort too high to maintain, the difference between intention and execution exposed in real time. And I saw Ethan glance in that direction again, not with superiority, not with concern, but with interest, like he was comparing data points instead of witnessing strain. And that was when the realization began to take shape, not fully formed, but present enough to demand attention. I increased the gravity again. 3.5 standard. The advisory lights intensified, shifting from soft pulses to steady illumination. The system now operating at levels reserved for specialized conditioning, not general assessment, and the effect on the room was immediate, more pronounced, more undeniable. Cadets lowering further, movements slowing to near stillness, breathing controlled but heavier, the environment now dictating behavior in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. Ethan exhaled slowly, not sharply, not forcefully, just a controlled breath, like someone adjusting to a change in altitude rather than a shift in gravitational force that should have made basic movement significantly more demanding. And then he looked back at me and said, "It feels lighter than expected." Not louder, not emphasized, just stated as if offering feedback on a piece of equipment that was not calibrated correctly. For a moment, I considered the possibility of a translation error, but his tone was consistent, his expression unchanged, and there was no ambiguity in the words themselves. Lighter than expected. At 3.5 standard gravity, the chamber did not change. The system did not fluctuate. The numbers remained constant on the display in front of me, And yet the statement hung in the air with a kind of quiet certainty that forced a reevaluation of the entire scenario. I have heard cadets complain about gravity before. I have heard them describe it as heavy, oppressive, overwhelming. I have heard them request adjustments, question calibration, even challenge the necessity of the exercise, but I have never heard anyone describe increased gravity as lighter than expected, not at any level, not under any condition. I stepped closer, reducing the distance between us to less than 6 feet. Because proximity eliminates doubt, it removes the possibility of misreading subtle indicators, and I needed to be certain of what I was observing. His posture remained aligned. His balance remained centered. There was no visible compensation in his stance, no micro-corrections in his movement, nothing that suggested he was experiencing the same force as the rest of the room, and yet he was standing in the same environment, under the same conditions, governed by the same system. Expected based on what? I asked, because the answer to that question would define everything that came next. He considered it for a moment, not searching for words, but selecting them, and then he replied, calm, direct, as if the answer should have been obvious from the beginning, based on baseline conditions back home. And just like that, the variable I had been trying to isolate expanded into something far larger than the chamber we were standing in. Baseline conditions back home. The phrase stayed with me longer than it should have, not because of what it said, but because of how easily he said it, as if the environment we were standing in, the carefully calibrated chamber, the layered safety protocols, the controlled escalation of force, all of it was simply insufficient. I had read the files on Earth, of course I had. Every instructor does. We study incoming species, we analyze environmental data, we memorize numbers, gravity, atmosphere, biological tolerances, all of it converted into neat categories that make unfamiliar worlds feel manageable. Earth was listed at 1.03 standard gravity, slightly above baseline, notable but not extreme, classified as a high variability world, unpredictable weather systems, diverse ecosystems, but nothing in. Those reports suggested that 3.5 standard gravity would feel lighter than expected to one of its inhabitants. And yet Ethan Cole stood in front of me, not resisting, not enduring, but existing as if the chamber had failed to reach him in any meaningful way. Around us, the difference was becoming impossible to ignore. The cadets were no longer attempting to demonstrate control. They were maintaining it, holding position with deliberate effort, minimizing unnecessary motion, conserving energy under load, exactly as trained, exactly as designed. The system was working, the exercise was valid, the results were consistent across every species present, except one. I shifted my focus back to the control panel, verifying output again, 3.5 stable, no fluctuation, no lag in response time. The chamber was delivering exactly what I commanded, which meant the discrepancy was not mechanical, it was biological, or perhaps something beyond biological, something we had not properly defined. I made a decision then, not based on protocol, but on necessity, because controlled environments exist to reveal limits, and if the limit had not yet been reached, then the test was not complete. I increased the gravity again. 4.0 standard. This time the chamber responded with a deeper hum, not unstable, but strained at the edges of its intended operating range, the advisory lights shifting to a steady amber glow, a clear indication that we were approaching thresholds reserved for specialized training scenarios, not general instruction, and the effect on the room was immediate and undeniable. Several cadets lowered fully to one knee, not out of failure, but out of strategic adaptation, reducing surface area, stabilizing center of mass, minimizing the impact of increased force. Others remained standing but motionless, every movement calculated, every adjustment deliberate. The room had transitioned from training environment to survival exercise in a matter of seconds. And in the center of it all, Ethan Cole looked down at his hands. Not in confusion, not in strain, just observation. He flexed his fingers once, slowly, as if testing resistance, then relaxed them again, and that simple action carried a kind of quiet contradiction that did not belong in this space, because at 4.0 standard gravity, even minor movements require conscious effort, and yet has looked effortless, unforced, almost casual. I stepped closer again, reducing the distance further because proximity removes doubt, and I needed certainty now, not theory, not assumption, certainty. Cadet Cole, I said, maintaining a steady tone, because authority must remain consistent even when understanding does not define baseline conditions. He looked up, meeting my gaze directly. No hesitation, no calculation, just a straightforward response, as if the question itself required no effort to answer. Standard training back home varies, he said, voice calm, even under the increased load, but we usually start around 2.5 and go up from there. The words settled into the space between us with a weight that had nothing to do with gravity, and for a brief moment, I considered the possibility that I had misheard, that the translation matrix had introduced an error, because the implication of that statement did not align with any data I had ever reviewed, any report I had ever studied, any classification I had ever trusted. 2.5 as a starting point. Not a maximum, not a specialized condition. A starting point. I glanced back at the panel, then at the room, then back at him, and in that sequence, something shifted, not in the system, not in the chamber, but in my understanding of the equation we were working with. Gravity had always been the constant, the reliable variable that defined limits across species. But standing here, watching a human cadet treat 4.0 standard gravity as a mild inconvenience at most, I began to realize that the constant might not be gravity at all. It might be the assumptions we built around it. 2.5 as a starting point. The statement did not just challenge the parameters of the exercise, it rewrote them entirely, because if what he said was accurate, then everything inside this chamber was not a test for him. It was a reduction, a scaled-down environment that failed to represent his baseline reality. I had built my entire methodology on the assumption that increasing gravity would reveal weakness, that it would compress performance into measurable limits, that it would force adaptation or expose failure. And for every species I had ever trained, that assumption held true. It was predictable, reliable, repeatable, until now. I looked at the panel again, not because I doubted the numbers, but because I needed to confirm them one more time before taking the next step. 4.0 standard gravity, stable output, system within operational thresholds but approaching upper limits. The chamber was doing exactly what it was designed to do, which meant the only remaining variable was the human standing in front of me. I made the decision without announcing it, because some escalations do not require explanation, they require observation. I pushed the system further. For 0.5 standard, the chamber responded with a deeper resonance, not unstable, but strained, like a structure carrying more weight than it was originally intended to support. The advisory lights shifted from amber to a sharper tone, a clear indication that we were now operating at levels reserved for extreme conditioning scenarios, and the effect across the room was immediate, undeniable. Several cadets lowered completely, not collapsing, but transitioning into positions that minimized strain. Others remained upright, but motionless. Every movement eliminated, every breath controlled. The environment had crossed from difficult into defining. This was the point where gravity stopped being a tool and became a boundary. And in the center of it, Ethan Cole adjusted his stance slightly. Not a defensive adjustment, not a compensatory shift, just a small repositioning of his feet, like someone finding a more comfortable way to stand during a long conversation. And that detail carried more weight than the entire system output, because it suggested that what we considered extreme was, to him, still within the range of casual adaptation. I stepped closer again, now within arm's reach, close enough to observe the smallest indicators, the micro movements that reveal strain before it becomes visible. But there were none. His posture remained aligned, his breathing steady, his balance centered, no tremor, no hesitation, nothing that suggested he was approaching any kind of limit. Around us, the room had become silent in a different way, not the controlled silence of focus, but the quiet that comes when everyone recognizes that something is no longer following expected patterns. Attention had shifted, not just to the gravity, but to him, because even under pressure, even while maintaining their own stability, the cadets could see the difference, and that difference was becoming impossible to ignore. I spoke again, not to assert control, but to gather information, because at this point, information mattered more than authority. Cadet Cole, I said, voice steady. At what point would this environment become restrictive for you? He considered the question for a moment, not because it was difficult, but because he was calibrating the answer, selecting a range rather than a precise value. And then he responded with the same calm tone he had maintained since the beginning of the session. Hard to say exactly, he said. Depends on duration, movement, and load, but standing still like this, maybe around 5.5 or 6 before it starts to feel limiting. The words settled into the space with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation, and for the first time in 19 years, I found myself without an immediate framework to process what I was hearing, because 5.5 to 6 standard gravity was not a training range. It was a classification threshold, the point at which most species required specialized equipment just to function. And he was describing it as a point of mild limitation, not failure, not collapse limitation. I turned back to the panel, not out of doubt, but out of necessity, because if the limit had not yet been reached, then the test was incomplete, and incomplete tests do not provide answers. The system warning indicators pulse steadily now, not urgent, but insistent, reminding me that further escalation would push the chamber beyond its intended operational envelope. And for a brief moment, I considered stopping, not out of concern for the cadets. They were already adapting as best they could, but because the system itself had limits. And pushing beyond those limits introduced variables I could not fully control. Then I looked back at Ethan Cole, standing at the center of a 4.5 standard gravity field, as if it were an ordinary environment. And I realized that the greater variable was not the system. It was the assumption that we had already reached the boundary of what needed to be tested. I placed my hand on the control interface again, not with hesitation, but with a clarity I had not felt since the session began, because whatever came next would not just define his limits, it would redefine ours. I did not remove my hand from the control interface this time. I simply paused with it resting there, feeling the faint vibration of the system through the panel as it held 4.5 standard gravity steady across the chamber. The hum deeper now, more pronounced, like the structure itself was acknowledging that we were approaching the edge of its intended function. And for the first time since the session began, the system was not the only thing being tested. The cadets had adapted as far as they could, most of them now in stabilized positions, low stances, reduced profiles, minimal movement, their training holding under pressure, but no longer advancing. They had reached their operational ceiling, not failure, but limit. And that distinction matters, because a limit is where growth stops unless something changes. I looked at Ethan Cole again, still standing, still balanced, still unchanged in every measurable way, and I realized that whatever came next would not be about pushing him. It would be about understanding him. I increased the gravity to 5.0 standard. The chamber responded immediately, not with instability, but with resistance, the hum shifting into a lower frequency that resonated through the floor and into the walls, the advisory lights now steady and bright, a clear signal that we had entered a range where the system was no longer just operating, it was compensating, distributing load across every structural reinforcement it had, maintaining integrity under conditions it was not originally designed to sustain for extended periods. The effect on the room was absolute. Movement ceased almost entirely. Even controlled breathing became more deliberate, slower, deeper. Every cadet now fully committed to maintaining position rather than demonstrating capability. This was no longer a training environment for them. It was a boundary condition, a point of reference they would remember long after the session ended. And in the center of it, Ethan Cole finally changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that matched the escalation around him. He shifted his stance again, this time slightly wider, a small adjustment of foot placement, a subtle lowering of his center of gravity, the kind of change that suggested awareness rather than strain, like someone recognizing that the environment had become less efficient for their previous posture and choosing to optimize rather than react. That was the first indicator, not of weakness, but of acknowledgement. I stepped closer, until I was directly in front of him, no more than 3 feet away, close enough to observe the smallest variations, The micro delays, the subtle cues that would confirm we had finally reached a point where the system and the subject were aligned. His breathing had changed, but only slightly, still controlled, still steady, but now deliberate in a way it had not been before, not labored, not forced, just intentional. His shoulders remained relaxed. His posture remained aligned. There was no tremor, no instability, nothing that suggested he was approaching failure, only that he had recognized the increase and adjusted accordingly. I spoke again, not loudly, because volume was unnecessary. The entire room was already focused, every cadet aware that something beyond routine was happening. "Cadet Cole," I said, "this is 5.0, standard gravity." He nodded once, the same efficient motion as before, but this time there was a slight pause afterward. Not hesitation, but processing, like he was comparing the current condition to an internal reference point. "Yeah," he said, calm, measured, "that feels closer." Closer. Not extreme. Not overwhelming. Closer. The word carried more weight than the entire system output, because it implied that we had only just entered a range that approached his expectation, not exceeded it. Around us, the silence shifted again. Not just focus now, but attention sharpened into something else, something closer to realization. The cadets were no longer just enduring the environment. They were observing him, measuring themselves against something they did not yet understand. And that comparison was changing the way they perceive the exercise. I glanced back at the control panel, the warning indicator steady, the system holding, but only just. And for a moment, I considered the implications of pushing further, not just for the chamber, but for what it would reveal, because every escalation so far had not broken him. It had only brought him closer to a baseline we had never accounted for. I returned my gaze to Ethan Cole, standing at 5.0 standard gravity with nothing more than a slight adjustment in stance and a measured breath. And I understood something that had not been clear at the start of this session. We were not increasing gravity to test the human. We were increasing gravity to discover how far our understanding of normal had been limited all along. The word closer did not leave the room quietly. It settled into the silence like a recalibration point, and I could feel the shift in perception ripple outward, not just in my own assessment, but across every cadet present, because at 5.0 standard gravity, there should not be room for casual language. There should not be space for subjective comparison. There should only be survival of position and control of breath. And yet Ethan Cole stood there treating it as a reference point, instead of a limit. I kept my posture steady, my voice neutral, because authority must remain intact even when certainty begins to fracture. And I turned my attention back to the control panel, not to confirm the numbers this time, but to consider what they meant in context of what I was observing. The system was holding, but the margin was narrowing. The structural compensation algorithms were active, distributing load across reinforcement nodes, maintaining equilibrium under stress that exceeded standard operational design. And for the first time since I've been assigned to this facility, the chamber was no longer the dominant variable in the equation. He was. I made the next adjustment slowly, not because I hesitated, but because I wanted to observe the transition, to see exactly where the environment would begin to assert itself against him in a measurable way. 5.5 standard gravity. The response was immediate and absolute. The chamber's hum dropped into a deeper register, a resonance that could be felt through the soles of the feet, through the structure, through the air itself. The advisory lights intensified to a steady high-level warning, and across the room, the effect was final. No further adaptation, no further adjustment. Every cadet had reached their limit, positions locked. Movement reduced to the bare minimum required to maintain balance. Even observation became secondary to endurance, because at this level, attention costs energy, and energy must be conserved. The room had transitioned fully into a boundary state. I did not look at them for long. My focus remained on Ethan Cole. He did not drop. He did not freeze. He did not even fully stabilize in the way the others had. Instead, he adjusted again, this time more deliberately, lowering his center of gravity slightly, widening his stance another inch or two. aligning his posture with a precision that suggested familiarity rather than reaction, like someone stepping into a known condition rather than encountering a new one. His breathing changed again, still controlled, but now visibly measured, not strained, not forced, just calibrated, and that detail mattered because it was the first clear indication that the environment had finally reached a point where it required conscious engagement from him. Not failure, engagement. I stepped closer until there was no distance left to close, standing directly in front of him, close enough to hear the rhythm of his breath without relying on observation alone, and I spoke, not to challenge, not to test, but to confirm. "Cadet Cole," I said, "current assessment." He took a single breath before answering, not because he needed it, but because he was measuring his response, aligning it with the question in a way that suggested he understood exactly what I was asking for. "This is where it starts to feel like training," he said, voice steady, tone unchanged, as if he were describing a familiar routine rather than standing in an environment that had already defined the limits of every other cadet in the room. "Starts to feel like training. Not maximum, not extreme. The beginning." The statement did not just redefine his limits, it reframed the entire purpose of the chamber, because what we had designed as an upper boundary condition was, to him, an entry point. I did not respond immediately. There was nothing to say that would fit within the framework I had used for 19 years, because that framework no longer applied. I turned back to the panel, the warning indicators now steady and insistent, the system operating at the edge of its capacity, and I understood that any further increase would not just test him, it would test the integrity of the chamber itself. And yet, I also understood that stopping here would leave the most important variable unresolved. I looked back at Ethan Cole, standing at 5.5 standard gravity, engaged but not overwhelmed, present but not pressured in the way every other species would be, and I realized that the limit I had been searching for might not exist within the parameters of the system at all. It might exist somewhere beyond it. And that meant the next decision was no longer about training. It was about discovery. I kept my hand on the control interface longer this time. Not because I was uncertain, but because I was calculating something that had never needed calculation before: the relationship between system capacity and subject tolerance, the margin between structural limitation and biological reality. Because for the first time in my career, those two variables were no longer aligned. The chamber was not designed to answer the question in front of me. It was designed to confirm assumptions that no longer held. I increased the gravity to 6.0 standard. The response was immediate and unmistakable. The chamber did not just hum now. It resonated, a deep, continuous vibration that carried through every surface, every support beam, every reinforced joint. The warning indicators shifted to maximum, steady and unblinking. The system was no longer operating within safe parameters. It was maintaining integrity under stress that exceeded its intended design envelope. And across the room, the effect reached its final stage: complete stillness, not from control, but from necessity. Every cadet locked into position, no movement left to give, no adjustment left to make. They had reached the absolute boundary of what their bodies could negotiate. The environment had stopped being interactive. It had become fixed. I did not look at them. I already knew what I would see. My focus remained where it had been since the first anomaly appeared. Ethan Cole did not drop. He did not lock. He did not even fully stabilize in the way the others had. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, just a fraction, as if engaging more directly with the force rather than resisting it, his stance widening another inch, his center lowering with deliberate precision. And for the first time since the session began, there was a visible sign that the environment had crossed into a range that required effort. Not failure, not strain, effort. His breathing deepened, not irregular, not forced, but more pronounced, each inhale measured, each exhale controlled, like someone transitioning from rest to active engagement, and that distinction mattered more than any system reading I had ever monitored. I stepped closer again, though there was nowhere left to close, standing directly in front of him, observing not just posture, but timing, the micro delays between breath and movement, the subtle synchronization that reveals how a body interacts with force at its limits. "Cadet Cole," I said, voice steady, though the environment around us was anything but current condition. He did not answer immediately this time. Not because he could not, because he was assessing. His eyes moved briefly, not toward the panel, not toward the other cadets, but inward, like he was referencing something that did not exist in this room. And then he exhaled slowly before speaking. Now it feels like work, he said, tone calm, grounded, as if you were describing the start of a routine exercise rather than standing inside a chamber operating beyond its intended limits. Work, not maximum, not critical. Work. The word settled into the space with a kind of finality that changed everything. Because at 6.0 standard gravity, there should not be a next step, there should not be a progression beyond this point within this system. And yet his response implied that we had only just reached a threshold where effort began, not where capacity ended. I turned back to the control panel. The warning indicators no longer advisory, but absolute. The system was at its limit, not in theory, but in function. Any further increase would not be a test of the subject. It would be a test of the chamber itself. And that distinction mattered now more than ever. For the first time in 19 years, I hesitated not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition, because the question in front of me had changed. It was no longer how much gravity a cadet could withstand. It was how much reality the system could represent before it failed to match the subject it was designed to measure. I looked back at Ethan Cole, standing at 6.0 standard gravity, engaged but controlled, working but not overwhelmed, and I understood something that none of the data, none of the reports, none of the classifications had ever conveyed clearly enough. We did not bring a human into this chamber to see how they would perform under our conditions. We brought them here to discover that our conditions were not the standard we thought they were. And with the system at its limit and the subject still adapting, I realized that whatever came next would not be recorded as part of a training session. It would be recorded as a correction. I did not touch the control panel again, not because I could not, but because I understood that anything beyond this point would not provide more clarity. It would only expose the limitation of the system itself. And that was no longer the question I needed answered. The chamber was already at 6.0 standard gravity, the structure holding under maximum sustained load, the warning indicators fully engaged, and yet the subject in front of me remained operational in a way that redefined the entire purpose of this environment. I stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but widening my perspective, because what I needed now was not proximity, it was context. Around us, the cadets were no longer part of the test. They had become reference points, fixed markers that defined what 6.0 meant for every known species in this room, and by contrast, what it did not mean for the one standing in the center. Their positions were locked, controlled, maintained through training and discipline, but static. There was no progression left in them under these conditions, no further adaptation possible without reducing the load. Ethan Cole, by contrast, was still in motion, not large movements, not dramatic shifts, but small, deliberate adjustments that indicated ongoing interaction with the environment rather than simple endurance. He rolled his shoulders once, slow and controlled, then settled them again, testing alignment, optimizing posture, and that detail mattered because you do not optimize in a condition you are barely surviving. You optimize in a condition you intend to work within. I watched his feet next, the way he distributed weight, the micro shifts between heel and toe, the subtle recalibration that kept his center balanced without visible strain, and I realized that what I had been calling effort was not effort in the way we defined it. It was engagement, active participation in a force field that for everyone else had become a boundary. Cadet Cole, I said, not to test him now, but to document, because this was no longer a training exercise, it was data collection of the highest order. If this is work, what would you consider maximum? He took a breath, slightly deeper than before, not forced but deliberate, and for the first time since the session began, there was a pause that carried weight, not uncertainty, but calculation, like he was translating an internal scale into terms I would understand. Standing still like this, he said, voice steady despite the environment, probably somewhere around 7, maybe a little higher if I had to hold it for a short time, but that would start to feel like a limit. 7. The number did not register immediately as a value. It registered as a displacement, a distance between what we could measure and what he considered normal, because 7.0 standard gravity was not a training parameter, it was a theoretical boundary for most known species, a point at which function required external support systems. And he was describing it as the beginning of limitation, not the end of capability. I did not respond. There was nothing to add that would not reduce the clarity of what had just been established. Instead, I turned my attention to the system diagnostics, not to confirm the current state, but to understand the gap, the difference between what the chamber could produce and what the subject could withstand, because that gap was now the most important variable in the room. The system was at capacity, every reinforcement engaged, every safety threshold active, and still it was not enough to reach the boundary he described. I looked back at him, standing in the center of a 6.0 standard gravity field, engaged, controlled, operating within a range that for him was just the beginning of meaningful effort, and I understood something with absolute clarity. We had not been underestimating human strength. We had been underestimating human baseline. There is a difference, and that difference changes everything. I stepped back another half pace, allowing the room to come back into focus as a whole. The fixed cadets, the strain system, the single variable that did not align with either, and I made the only decision that made sense within the limits of the equipment available. I reached for the control panel and began reducing the gravity, not because the test was complete, but because the system had reached its limit long before the subject had, and continuing beyond that point would only confirm what was already clear. As the gravity began to decrease, slowly, deliberately, I kept my eyes on Ethan Cole, watching for the moment when his posture would change, when his engagement would ease, when the environment would finally drop below the threshold he considered work, and I realized that whatever that point was, it would not redefine him. It would redefine us. The gravity began to drop in controlled increments, 6.0 to 5.8, then 5.5, the deep resonance of the chamber easing with each adjustment, the structural strain reducing in a way that was almost audible, like a system exhaling after holding tension for too long. And across the room, the effect was immediate, not dramatic, but measurable. Cadets who had been locked in position began to regain micromobility, small shifts in posture, controlled adjustments. Returning, the environment transitioning from absolute boundary back into something they could interact with again. I did not watch them. I already understood their limits. My focus remained fixed on Ethan Cole, because the reduction was not about them. It was about identifying the exact point where his engagement would change, where effort would transition back into something closer to baseline. At 5.5 standard gravity, he did not relax, not fully, but the deliberate engagement in his posture eased slightly, the tension in his stance reducing by a fraction, not enough to indicate relief, but enough to signal that the environment had crossed back below his defined threshold of work. He shifted his weight once, a smooth transfer from one foot to the other, not compensating, simply recalibrating, like someone stepping down from a moderate incline on a level ground. That was the first marker. At 5.0, the change became clearer, his shoulders relaxed further, his breathing returned to the earlier steady rhythm I had observed at the beginning of the session, not measured for effort now, but consistent for efficiency, and the subtle precision in his posture transitioned into something more natural, less calculated, as if the need for optimization had been removed. Around us, the cadets were recovering in stages, some rising from lower positions, others maintaining upright stance with renewed control, but all of them still operating within a range that demanded attention, while for him, that same range had already passed. I continued the reduction, for 0.5, for 0.0, each step returning the chamber closer to its designed operational range, the warning indicators dimming from maximum to advisory, then to stable, the system reclaiming its intended balance. And with each decrease, the contrast became more pronounced, not because he changed dramatically, but because he did not need to. At 4.0, he rolled his shoulders once more, a casual motion, not testing alignment now, but releasing it, the kind of movement that follows completion rather than effort, and that detail carried a kind of final confirmation that no data point could match. I stepped back another pace, allowing the entire chamber to come back into view, the cadets regaining composure, the system stabilizing, and the human at the center no longer defined by the environment, but independent of it in a way that none of the others could replicate. Cadet Cole, I said, not as a challenge, not as an instruction, but as acknowledgement. At what point does this feel normal? He glanced around the room briefly, not evaluating others, just orienting himself within the changing conditions, then looked back at me with the same calm expression he had maintained since the beginning. Around 3, he said, simple, direct, as if describing something obvious, something that required no further explanation. 3.0, standard gravity. A level that had already pushed most cadets into visible strain, a level that marked the beginning of difficulty for every other species in this room. And for him, it was normal. I did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to add that would improve the clarity of what had just been established. Instead, I turned to the control panel one final time and reduced the gravity to standard baseline, 1.0, the chamber settling fully, the hum fading into silence, the system returning to its default state as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Not in the chamber, not in the system, in the understanding of everyone who had witnessed it. The cadets straightened, regained full mobility, breathing normalized, posture restored, but their focus had shifted, not to me, not to the system, but to him, because the comparison was no longer theoretical. It was observed, measured, undeniable. I looked at Ethan Cole one last time, standing at baseline gravity with the same relaxed posture he had started with, unchanged from the beginning in a way that now carried entirely different meaning, and I understood that the session had not revealed a stronger cadet. It had revealed a different standard. Not higher, not lower, different. And that difference would not stay contained within this chamber. It would change how we trained, how we measured, how we defined capability across every species that came through this facility. Because once you see the gap between assumption and reality, you cannot go back to believing they are the same. No one spoke immediately after the chamber returned to baseline, and that silence was not confusion. It was recalibration. The kind that happens when a system, biological or otherwise, is forced to process information that does not fit within its existing framework. And for the cadets standing around me, that framework had just been dismantled without a single direct confrontation. I stepped away from the control panel fully now, no longer monitoring, no longer adjusting, because the system had done everything it could, and what remained was no longer about gravity. It was about interpretation. I turned to face the room, not as an instructor delivering evaluation, but as an observer addressing a variable that had become central to every future session that would take place in this chamber. The cadets were upright again, posture restored, breathing steady, but their attention had shifted entirely, not toward me, not toward the system, but toward Ethan Cole, because in a training environment built on comparison, he had become the new reference point, and none of them knew how to measure against it. I let the silence extend a moment longer, not as a tactic, but because it was necessary, because what I was about to say required space, not for emphasis, but for accuracy. What you experienced, I said finally, voice even controlled, was not an extreme condition. I watched their reactions carefully, not outward movement, but micro-responses, the tightening of focus, the slight shift in posture that indicates attention sharpening, because words matter more when they challenge expectation. It was a relative one. I paused, not for effect, but to allow the distinction to settle, because the difference between absolute and relative is where misunderstanding begins. I turned slightly, gesturing toward Ethan without fully directing attention away from the group, because he was not the subject of instruction, he was the context. For most of you, 3.0 standard gravity represents the beginning of strain, I continued. 4.0 represents the edge of controlled function, and anything beyond that becomes a boundary condition. No one moved. No one needed to. They had just lived those numbers. For Cadet Cole, I said, 3.0 is normal. The statement did not require emphasis. It carried its own weight. I could see the recalculation happening in real time, not dramatic, not visible in large gestures, but present in the way their attention held, in the way their posture remained aligned even after the pressure had been removed, because understanding had replaced assumption. I took a step forward, closing the distance between myself and the group, not to assert control, but to reinforce clarity. This chamber is calibrated to test limits based on known baselines, I said, but baselines are not universal. They are environmental. I let that settle as well, because it was the core of the shift we had just experienced. Earth, I continued, is classified as a high-variability world with slightly elevated gravity. I paused again, not because I was uncertain, but because I was choosing precision over habit. That classification is incomplete. The words did not come from theory. They came from observation, from data collected in real time, from a session that had redefined the parameters it was built on. I turned back toward Ethan Cole, not as a subject, but as a confirmation of what had just been established. He stood where he had been from the beginning, posture relaxed, breathing steady, no sign that anything significant had occurred from his perspective, and that detail mattered more than any metric we could record. I faced the cadets again. You were not tested against maximum gravity, I said. You were tested against your own assumptions. That was the truth of it, stripped of complexity, reduced to its most accurate form. Because the chamber had not changed, the system had not failed, the only variable that shifted was understanding. I allowed the silence to return after that, not as a pause, but as a conclusion, because there was nothing left to instruct in the traditional sense. Training would continue. Protocols would adapt. Parameters would be recalibrated. But the most important outcome of this session had already been achieved. Not improved performance, not increased tolerance, a corrected perspective. And in a system built on measurement, that correction would matter more than any number the chamber could produce. The silence that followed did not break the way it normally would at the end of a session. There was no immediate movement toward the exits, no casual conversation, no release of tension through routine behavior. Because what had just occurred was not something that could be dismissed as a difficult exercise. It had altered the internal scale each cadet used to measure themselves, and scales do not reset instantly. I watched them carefully, not for compliance, but for adjustment, because this was the moment where understanding either solidified or fractured. One cadet shifted their stance slightly, not out of fatigue, but out of thought, recalibrating posture, as if trying to reconcile what their body had experienced with what their mind had just learned. Another glanced briefly at the chamber walls, then back at Ethan Cole, as if expecting the environment to reveal something they had missed the first time, but the chamber remained unchanged, neutral, silent, a tool that had done its job without explanation. I stepped forward again, not to reassert authority, but to anchor the transition, because leaving this moment undefined would allow assumptions to return, and assumptions were what had just been corrected. You will all record your baseline thresholds from this session, I said, voice steady, direct, not as limits, but as reference points. I paused briefly, allowing the instruction to settle before continuing, because wording mattered now more than ever. Those reference points are not universal. They're specific to you. I let my gaze move across the group, ensuring that the statement was received as intended, not as a reduction, but as a clarification, because in a system built on comparison, individuality is often mistaken for inconsistency, and that mistake had just been exposed. I turned slightly toward Ethan again, not to isolate him, but to integrate him into the framework that would define future training. Cadet Cole's baseline is different, I said, not because he is exceptional in the way you might assume, but because his environment shaped him under conditions you have not experienced. The distinction was important because labeling something as exceptional creates distance, while understanding it as environmental creates possibility. And what I needed from them was not admiration, it was adaptation. I walked a slow line across the chamber floor, the space now quiet in a different way, not tense, not uncertain, but focused, the kind of focus that comes when new information has not yet been categorized. Training is not about matching another individual's output, I continued. It is about expanding your own capacity relative to your baseline. I stopped near the center again, positioning myself where the earlier demonstration had taken place, because location reinforces memory, and memory reinforces learning. What you witnessed today is not a ceiling, I said. It is a data point. The words carried weight because they removed the emotional interpretation from the observation, reducing it to something actionable, something measurable, something that could be built upon rather than reacted to. I let that settle, then added the final piece, the one that would define how this session would be remembered. And data points change. I stepped back then, signaling the end of the instruction phase without dismissing the importance of what had occurred, because this was not something that ended with a command. It ended with understanding. The cadets began to move gradually, not all at once, but in sequence, posture returning to normal patterns, breathing fully relaxed. But their focus remained altered, their awareness sharpened in a way that would carry into every future exercise. Some looked at the chamber differently now, not as a challenge to overcome, but as a measurement tool to interpret. Others looked at Ethan Cole, not with the earlier curiosity or dismissal, but with a quiet recognition that what they had assumed about human limits no longer applied in the way they thought. I remained where I was for a moment longer, observing the transition, because this was the part that could not be taught directly. It had to be processed, internalized, integrated. Then I turned my attention to the system one last time. The panel now calm, the indicators neutral, the chamber restored to its default state, and I understood that the next time this room was used, it would not operate under the same assumptions it had before. Not because the system had changed, but because we had. And that difference, more than any increase in gravity, would define what came next. The chamber emptied in stages, not with the usual rhythm of a completed session, but with a slower, more deliberate movement, as if each cadet was carrying something that required attention before it could be set aside. And I remained where I was, not because there was more to instruct, but because this was the moment where observation mattered most, the moment after the system resets, when the real change becomes visible. Ethan Cole did not leave immediately. He stood where he had been from the beginning, posture relaxed, hands at his sides, as if waiting for confirmation that the session had truly ended, not out of uncertainty, but out of habit. And that detail, small as it was, reinforced everything I had just recalibrated in my own understanding, because his behavior had been consistent from start to finish, unaffected by the escalation, unchanged by the reduction, aligned with a baseline that existed outside this environment. I stepped toward him, not with the intent to challenge or evaluate, but to close the loop on something that had shifted beyond the scope of standard protocol. "Cadet Cole," I said, voice even, the same tone I had used throughout the session, because consistency matters when everything else has changed. Your baseline training conditions, are they standardized across your homeworld? He looked at me, not surprised by the question, not guarded, just attentive, and he considered it for a moment before answering, not searching for the right words, but selecting the most accurate ones. "Not exactly," he said, calm as before. "It varies depending on the program, but higher gravity environments are common, especially for conditioning." He paused briefly, then added, "You get used to it." The statement was simple, almost understated, but it carried more weight than any report I had ever reviewed, because it reframed what I had just witnessed not as an anomaly, but as an outcome, the result of adaptation over time. Not an exception to the rule, but a different rule entirely. I nodded once, not as acknowledgement of completion, but as recognition of something that would require integration into every aspect of future training. "Understood," I said, and for the first time since the session began, the word carried a different meaning, not confirmation of instruction, but acceptance of correction. He gave a small nod in return, then turned and walked toward the exit, his movement unchanged from the moment he had entered the chamber, smooth, efficient, unburdened by the conditions that had defined the experience for everyone else. I watched him go, not out of curiosity, but because understanding requires observation beyond the point of demonstration, and what I saw was consistency, not performance, not effort, but consistency, the kind that only comes from a baseline that does not fluctuate under pressure. The last of the cadets exited shortly after, the chamber returning to complete stillness, the system idle, the environment neutral, and I remain alone with the data, not just the recorded metrics on the panel, but the corrected framework that would now define how those metrics were interpreted. I turned back to the control interface, reviewing the session logs, the incremental increases, The system warnings, the stabilization points, all of it recorded precisely as expected, and yet none of it captured the most important outcome, because the system had not been designed to measure the difference between expectation and reality. That measurement had to be made here in understanding, in adaptation, in the quiet recalibration of what we considered normal. I placed my hand on the panel one last time, not to initiate another test, but to acknowledge the boundary that had just been revealed, not a limit of gravity, but a limit of assumption, and I understood with complete clarity that the next time this chamber was used, the question would be different. Not how much can this subject endure, but what does this subject define as baseline? Because that is where the real difference lies, not in extremes, in what is considered normal. And in that difference, everything changes. We had not discovered a stronger species. We had discovered that our scale was incomplete. And once that realization takes hold, it does not fade. It expands. It reshapes every comparison, every expectation, every measure of capability moving forward. Because gravity does not define strength. It reveals perspective. And on that day, inside a chamber built to measure limits, we learned that humans do not operate at the edge of what we consider possible. They begin there.